August 3, 1943, northern Sicily. A canvas hospital tent holds the sounds of a modern army in pain, the clink of metal trays, the soft murmur of nurses, the cough of men with dust still in their throats, and, far away, the dull punctuation of artillery. Lieutenant General George S. Patton walks down the aisle with the posture of a man who believes war is won by force of will. He stops at cots where bandaged arms and shattered legs make suffering visible and therefore, in his mind, honorable. Then he notices a soldier with no obvious wound, sitting slumped, eyes unfocused, shoulders collapsed. The soldier says he is nervous. Patton does not hear injury. He hears weakness. The moment tightens like a wire, and then it snaps, a slap in a hospital ward, an explosion of rage, and a scandal that will crawl up the chain of command and out into the American public, forcing a war machine to confront an invisible wound it does not yet know how to name. Subscribe to the channel right now if you want documentary stories like this, told from inside the moment, with the full human cost, the hard choices, and the consequences that history never forgets. To understand why Patton struck those men, and why the Army reacted the way it did, you have to step into the world of 1943, when the United States was still learning how to fight a total war with citizen soldiers. You have to understand Sicily as more than a place on a map. Sicily was heat and dust, steep hills and stone walls, villages that looked peaceful until a machine gun opened from a window, roads that choked with traffic, and units that advanced until they could not advance anymore. Sicily was also a proving ground for commanders who believed that speed could save lives. By ending campaigns sooner, Patton believed in speed the way some men believe in religion. He believed that momentum was a moral force. If an army kept moving, it stayed alive. If an army slowed down, it bled. That belief made him brilliant at exploiting opportunities. It also made him impatient with anything that looked like delay, including the kind of delay that comes when a human nervous system finally refuses to keep obeying orders. In that era, the Army had terms for psychological collapse under fire, but it did not have a stable consensus about what those terms meant. The First World War had left a phrase in the culture like a scar, shell shock. Some people used it clinically, others used it as an insult. By the Second World War, military medicine also used phrases like battle fatigue, combat exhaustion, war neurosis, or simply nerves. The language mattered because language determined whether a man was treated as a patient or judged as a failure. Doctors and nurses in forward hospitals saw patterns that were hard to deny: men shaking so badly they could not hold a cup, men staring through people as if they were not present, men sweating and vomiting without fever, men who could not sleep and then could not think, men who cried without warning, men whose bodies looked intact, but whose minds behaved like they had been shattered by shrapnel. Line officers, under relentless pressure to keep units filled, sometimes saw a different pattern: men leaving their front lines and not returning. In any large army, some men do try to escape danger. The problem in 1943 was that the system was not good at separating the few who were pretending from the many who were collapsing for real. When institutions cannot separate those categories, they often choose the harshest story because it feels safer. Harshness feels like control, and control is the currency of command. Patton was a commander built for a certain kind of war. He was theatrical, demanding, and obsessed with discipline. He cultivated an image that made subordinates feel like they were serving under a commander from another age: polished helmet, sharp language, ritual, and a constant insistence that courage was not a feeling but a behavior. He could be personally brave, even reckless. He could also be personally vain. He demanded standards that inspired some and crushed others. In his mind, morale was not a soft atmosphere. Morale was a weapon. He believed that fear was universal and unavoidable, but he believed that any man could master it through will, pride, and training. He did not easily accept the idea that fear could become an injury, a condition that did not yield to shame. When a commander cannot accept that reality, he tends to interpret breakdown as a choice. And once he interprets it as a choice, punishment feels logical. There was also the operational context that sharpened his temper. Sicily was not fought in one clean strike. It was a series of pushes, stalls, flank moves, sudden firefights, and long exhausting marches. Units were constantly stretched. Command posts were constantly relocating. Supplies lagged. Communications failed. When soldiers were pushed hard for days and weeks, the casualty count included more than blood. It included men who stopped functioning. Those men moved into aid stations and hospitals. Some commanders worried about contagion, the fear that if breakdown was tolerated, it would spread, not because it was fake, but because humans learn from what they see. In that view, even real trauma could be treated like a discipline problem, because the institution feared the consequences of acknowledging it. Patton, already wired to see discipline as the answer to most problems, absorbed that fear and turned it into anger. So, when Patton visited field hospitals in early August, he walked into a place where his worldview was about to collide with medical reality. Evacuation hospitals were not calm clinics. They were pressure valves in canvas and wire. Surgeons worked quickly and brutally to save what could be saved. Nurses moved through rows of cots with practiced speed. Corpsmen carried stretchers, cleaned blood, delivered water, and watched men die. The air smelled of antiseptic, sweat, dust, and sickness. In that environment, an inspection by a famous general was not just a courtesy call. It was an event that shaped morale. A general might praise sacrifice. A general might promise victory. A general might also, with one careless act, teach everyone that certain kinds of suffering would be rewarded and other kinds would be despised. On August 3rd, Patton entered the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia during a tour. He moved among wounded men and praised those with visible injuries. This was the part of the world Patton understood. A bandage was proof. Blood was proof. A missing limb was proof. Then he approached a soldier whose injury was not visible. Records identify this soldier as Private Charles H. Cole. Cole had been moved through medical channels with complaints that fit the language of exhaustion, and he was in a ward where staff were sorting the damaged and the depleted. When Patton asked where he was wounded, Cole did not point to a wound. He said he was nervous. He said he could not take it.
In that moment, Patton did not see a nervous system that had been overloaded by battle. He saw a man refusing to do his duty while others were bleeding. His rage rose fast. He slapped Cool. He grabbed him by the collar. He cursed him. He accused him of cowardice. He demanded that Cool be sent back to the front and not admitted as a hospital case. He performed the punishment publicly, in front of staff and patients, as if humiliation itself could shock a man back into courage. In Patton's mind, shame was medicine. In a hospital ward, shame is poison. The tent absorbed the moment the way canvas absorbs sound. It did not echo dramatically, but it did not disappear. Nurses saw a commander strike a patient. Wounded men watched and learned what kind of weakness would be punished. Corpsmen saw rank used as a weapon inside a place that was supposed to be protected from violence. Even soldiers who admired Patton's fighting spirit could feel something wrong in that scene, because the battlefield has rules and the ward has rules, and Patton had violated the ward's rules. Patients are not targets. What happened after the slap made the story worse, not better. Medical staff examined Cool more closely and found he had a high fever. He would later be diagnosed with malaria parasites. The precise medical details mattered less than the implication. The man Patton struck was physically ill as well as exhausted. Even if Patton believed battle fatigue was not real, malaria was real, measurable, and deadly. Patton had not waited for facts. He had acted on ideology and instinct. He had treated uncertainty as guilt. That is one of the most dangerous habits a leader can have. A week later, the pattern repeated, and the consequences deepened. On August 10th, Patton visited another evacuation hospital. Accounts identify the second soldier as Private Paul G. Bennett. Bennett was visibly distressed, trembling, and unable to steady himself. He spoke of his nerves and the shelling he could not stand. Patton again interpreted what he heard as cowardice. He slapped Bennett. He shouted. He accused him of being a disgrace. Witnesses later reported that Patton threatened severe punishment, and that his anger escalated to the point where a pistol appeared in his hand. Whether the pistol was drawn as a threat or as a reflex of rage, the meaning inside that tent was the same. The general had lost control in a medical space. The hospital commander, Colonel Donald E. Currier, stepped between Patton and the patient. That intervention was more than a physical movement. It was an act of institutional self-defense. A hospital commander is responsible for the safety of patients and staff. Stepping between an enraged general and a trembling private was a way of saying that rank does not erase duty of care. It was also a way of preventing the incident from becoming something even worse. A slap was scandal enough. A gun in a ward was a nightmare. For the medical staff, the second incident crossed a line that could not be ignored. Medical leadership understood something commanders sometimes forget. If soldiers believe that admitting psychological collapse will bring humiliation or punishment, they will hide symptoms. Hidden symptoms do not vanish. They intensify. They return as breakdowns under fire, as accidents, as rage, as self-destruction, as long-term disability. In other words, cruelty towards stress casualties is not only morally wrong. It is operationally stupid. It pushes damage underground until it becomes more expensive. So reports were written and sent upward. In an army, stories often travel by gossip. This one traveled by documentation. The medical chain treated it as a serious breach because it threatened both ethics and authority. The reports moved into higher headquarters and eventually reached the top. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander in the theater. Eisenhower now faced a problem that was both moral and strategic. Patton was valuable. Patton delivered results. Patton also carried a risk that could explode in public and damage the Allied war effort. Eisenhower had to decide whether to destroy Patton or discipline him and preserve him. Eisenhower was not a man who led through flamboyant emotion. He led through control, balance, and coalition management. He understood that victory required talented subordinates, even difficult ones. But he also understood that command requires self-discipline, and that a leader who cannot control his temper undermines the entire system. Eisenhower issued a private and severe rebuke. He acknowledged that firm measures can be required in war. Then he drew a line. There was no excuse for brutality toward the sick, and no excuse for uncontrolled temper in front of subordinates. He ordered Patton to make personal amends to the men involved. That order mattered because it asserted a principle that war constantly tries to erase. Power is not permission. Even in war, there are boundaries. Even in war, a commander must control himself. Eisenhower's rebuke did not turn into a public spectacle at the time, because Eisenhower also wanted to contain the scandal. He feared that if the story became public immediately, the political pressure would force Patton's removal and waste a commander Eisenhower believed could still be useful. So Eisenhower chose discipline without public destruction. A private condemnation, forced apologies, and a quieter management of Patton's future assignments. Patton complied. He apologized to the soldiers and he apologized to medical staff. He also spoke to formations, expressing regret for excessive harshness. But compliance does not equal understanding. In private, Patton resented being forced to apologize. He believed he had been defending the fighting spirit of his army. He believed that if an army accepted battle fatigue as legitimate too easily, it would weaken. That belief shows the conflict between an older model of courage and a newer medical understanding of trauma. Patton believed courage was primarily willpower. Medical reality suggested courage could exist and still be overwhelmed by sustained threat. The forced apologies were not comfortable, and they were not meant to be comfortable. In an army, public humiliation can be used to correct behavior. Eisenhower used apology that way. As discipline, as a demonstration that Patton was not above the rules. The reaction among troops was complex. Some soldiers, fiercely loyal to Patton's aggressive leadership, reportedly responded with support, even chanting and cheering as if they wanted to protect him from shame. That loyalty did not change what happened in the ward. It only revealed how war bonds men to commanders who deliver victory, even when those commanders cross moral lines. Soldiers can love the leader who pushes them hardest. That does not make the leader's cruelty acceptable. It makes the human dynamic more complicated. For a while, the story stayed mostly inside the military system. War correspondents heard rumors. Soldiers talked. Nurses talked. But wartime censorship and wartime loyalty created a kind of temporary lid. Then, months later, the story reached the United States publicly. In November 1943, radio commentator Drew Pearson broadcast the incident. The telling that reached the public was sharp, dramatic, and sometimes blurred in detail, but the core fact did not need perfect precision to ignite outrage. A famous general had slapped a hospitalized soldier who said he could not take the shelling. The reaction in the United States split into two moral camps that both sounded certain. One camp defended Patton. They argued that war is not gentle, that discipline wins battles, and that commanders must crush weakness before weakness spreads. They framed the slap as harsh medicine, as a necessary shock. The other camp condemned Patton. They argued that striking a patient is abuse, that mental collapse can be real injury, and that the nation cannot claim moral purpose while humiliating its own wounded. For families with sons overseas, the idea of a general abusing a soldier in a hospital ward felt like betrayal. It was easier to accept the risk of death in combat than it was to accept cruelty in a place meant for healing. Officials issued careful statements. The army could not deny the incident entirely. It also did not want to sacrifice Patton to public fury. The public argument turned Patton into a symbol, either the necessary hard man or the abusive tyrant. Symbols are dangerous because they flatten reality. Patton was neither a pure hero nor a pure villain. He was a gifted commander with a dangerous worldview about psychological injury. He was capable of inspiring armies and humiliating individuals. He was a man who demanded self-control from soldiers and then demonstrated a moment of failed self-control himself. Inside the military, consequences often appear not as dramatic trials but as assignments. Patton did not command troops in combat for months after Sicily. The pause functioned as punishment and containment. He was kept away from the most visible roles because leadership could not risk another scandal. At the same time, Eisenhower did not throw him away. Patton's name had value. The enemy watched famous commanders and tried to predict Allied operations based on their movements. A famous commander could be used as a deception tool precisely because the enemy believed the legend. That is one of the strangest realities of war. Reputation becomes a weapon even when the man behind the reputation is temporarily sidelined. Later, when the Allied armies broke out in France and needed rapid exploitation, Patton returned to Major Combat Command and demonstrated the operational brilliance that made Eisenhower reluctant to discard him. That later success is part of why the slapping incidents remain debated. People try to balance results against behavior. They try to decide whether talent excuses cruelty. It does not. But war often creates situations where institutions tolerate severe flaws because they believe the alternative is worse. That is the grim arithmetic of command. The deeper significance of the story is not only Patton's temper. It is what the incident reveals about how armies and societies learn. In 1943, the Army was still developing doctrine for combat stress. Military psychiatrists and doctors were promoting a practical approach that can be summarized in 3 ideas. Treat stress casualties close to their units, treat them quickly, and treat them with the expectation that they can recover and return. This approach was not built on softness. It was built on results. It recognized that many men who collapse can be restored if treated promptly and without shame. It also recognized that sending men far to the rear, labeling them as failures, and isolating them from their units often turns temporary breakdown into long-term disability. Shame is a powerful amplifier of trauma. If a soldier believes that admitting panic makes him contemptible, he adds a second wound to the first. The wound of self-hatred. If a soldier believes his officers will call him a coward, he hides symptoms. If he hides symptoms, he may continue to function for a while, but the damage accumulates. Then it erupts, sometimes at the worst possible moment. In combat, that eruption can kill. In peacetime, it can destroy families, careers, and health. That is why the Patton incidents mattered beyond the slaps themselves. They sent a message to thousands of men. If your mind breaks, you will be punished. Eisenhower's rebuke attempted to counter that message. Even if you demand toughness, you do not brutalize the sick. Modern audiences often describe those soldiers as suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. The label did not exist in 1943, but the experience existed. Trauma locks the body into an alarm state. It distorts sleep. It invades memory. It changes threat perception so that danger feels present even when it is not. It can produce shaking, nausea, panic, numbness, and emotional collapse. It is not a moral failure. It is a physiological and psychological response to extreme threat and loss. In 1943, many medical professionals understood much of this in practical terms even if the modern label was absent. The obstacle was cultural acceptance, especially among commanders trained to equate toughness with virtue. Patton's worldview was an extreme version of that culture. He believed that fear could be mastered by will, and he built a command style that used humiliation and praise as tools to shape behavior. That style can create short-term performance, especially among men who respond to pressure. It can also crush men who are already near the edge. When Patton slapped those soldiers, he was not only punishing them. He was punishing the idea that the mind can be injured. He was trying to enforce a myth. That courage is always available to anyone who wants it enough. Myths can be useful in war. They can also be cruel, because myths do not care what human nervous systems can endure. Eisenhower's intervention shows another kind of leadership. Eisenhower did not lead by theatrical aggression. He led by controlling personalities and setting boundaries. His rebuke asserted that discipline is not only what you demand from others. Discipline is also what you demand from yourself. A general who cannot control his temper is not simply rude. He is dangerous, because his instability radiates through subordinates. Soldiers can endure harsh conditions if they believe their leaders are stable. When leaders become volatile, trust breaks. And without trust, discipline becomes fear, and fear is a brittle foundation. The public scandal adds a democratic layer. Democracies fight wars with citizen soldiers and citizen scrutiny. A general is not only a battlefield leader, he is a symbol of national values. When citizens hear that a general struck a patient, they do not only judge the general. They judge the institution that allowed it. They imagine their sons and brothers in that bed. They ask whether the nation is protecting the people it sends to fight. That is why the story erupted months later with such force. It was not only about Patton. It was about whether invisible injury was real and whether the army would treat it as real. If you zoom back into that hospital tent, the most important people in the story might not be Patton and Eisenhower at all. They might be the unnamed wounded men who watched from their cots. The man with shrapnel in his leg who looked up and saw a general slap a patient learned something about what kinds of suffering earned respect. The nurse who saw it learned something about what kind of power could invade a ward. The corpsman who had carried bodies all week learned something about how the chain of command could collide with care. Those lessons travel. They travel through rumor. They travel through memory. They travel through the way veterans later talk about themselves, often with shame, often in silence. This is the tension at the heart of the Patton slapping incidents. An army needs courage, and war produces trauma. If an army denies trauma, it loses people and it creates long-term damage that returns home. If an army treats every collapse as acceptable without treatment standards, it risks operational collapse. The solution is not softness. The solution is realism. Treating combat stress as an injury that can often be restored if handled properly, while still maintaining disciplined expectations and return to duty when possible. That balance is difficult. In 1943, it was still being learned, and Patton's outburst became a brutal case study in what happens when a powerful leader refuses to accept the lesson. Patton's later career ensures the story never becomes simple. He returned to prominence and fought with speed and creativity that saved Allied lives and crushed German positions. Many soldiers admired him deeply. That admiration is real. It also complicates moral judgment because humans want their heroes clean. History rarely grants clean heroes. Patton could be a brilliant commander and still be capable of cruelty toward the vulnerable. Those two facts can exist in the same man. The existence of one does not erase the other. If anything, it makes the story more urgent. Talent does not guarantee humanity, and results do not guarantee wisdom. In the end, the slapping incidents remain memorable because they expose a question that never fully disappears, even in modern armies with better mental health systems. What does a fighting institution do with invisible injury? When a soldier says, "I cannot take it," does the institution hear cowardice or injury? The answer determines whether the soldier is shamed or treated, whether he hides symptoms or seeks help, whether he returns to duty healthy or collapses later in worse ways. Patton heard cowardice. Eisenhower insisted on accountability and restraint. The army, pushed by scandal and by experience, slowly moved toward a more practical understanding. The mind can be wounded, and denying that wound does not make it go away. So return to the opening image. A tent in Sicily, August heat, rows of cots, a soldier sitting with no visible wound, and a famous general demanding a wound he can see. That is the moment where an old idea of courage collided with the reality of trauma. The slap did not only strike a cheek. It struck the myth that war only injures bodies. And once that myth is broken, a society has to decide what kind of strength it really wants. The strength that punishes the broken, or the strength that tells the truth about war and builds a way to carry people home with their humanity intact.